Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Today, discussing poetry once again with a book that I picked up because of a blurb by our several time former guest, James Matthew Wilson. The book is Paul Claudel's Five Great Odes. Paul Claudel was I guess, late 19th, early mid 20th century French Catholic poet. And it's really quite a remarkable work. It's kind of cosmic in its scope. I've never quite read anything like it, and it's one of the great recent books that I've read or discussed on this podcast. I think one of the best, counting it as a recent book because it's out in a new translation by Jonathan Geltner, published by Angelico Press, and Jonathan is my guest today. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Thomas.
So I had a little bit of familiarity with Clodell as a figure from reading the first volume of Raïssa Maritan's memoirs. What is it called? We Have Been Friends Together. And also one previous encounter with him, which was seeing a performance of Honegger's oratorio Joan of Arc at the Stake, which I believe he wrote the libretto for, if I'm not mistaken. I seem to remember that. But this was my first real encounter with him. I'm wondering, do you think that this work is a good introduction to Claudel's work, both in terms of its accessibility and in terms of how it relates to the rest of his body of work?
I think it would serve, yes. One of the interesting things about Clodell as a writer is that he wrote or composed in a number of genres, and he's perhaps best known as a writer of dramas. He also wrote prose, particularly in the latter part of his career. He wrote prose that was often a kind of highly poetic commentary on books of the Bible or on his perspective as a Christian poet. But he also was a lyric poet throughout most of his writing life, and the odes are his largest and most ambitious, and I would say most accomplished effort in lyric poetry. So they certainly stand for him as a lyric poet. They also stand for him very well in terms of his contribution to prosody, the way he wrote poetry in terms of its sound, its appearance on the page, its rhythm, that kind of thing. The stylistics of it, I guess you could say. The odes are where he perfected, really came into his own, his unique way of versifying his prosody, which was a form of free verse. He didn't invent free verse in French, but he sort of consummated it in a way that was influenced by his reading of Whitman, the American poet in the 19th century, and also a bit of Rimbaud. Well, a lot of Rimbaud, actually. The perhaps one of the most famous French poets of the 19th century. A huge influence on Clodell, both of those poets, when he was quite young. His prosody, his poetic style as a lyric writer comes out of there, reading them. And that style, which you see in the odes, is also in the dramas to a great extent, anyway. So it's poetic drama, and what he discovered in writing the odes is also what he was able to do in writing the dramas, some of which date from around the time that he was writing the odes, and some of them are a little afterwards. So he sort of evolved his prosody in both drama and in the lyric, in the odes, simultaneously. And that is what has perhaps had the most influence on French literature subsequently, is that prosody, that way of writing poetry. It's governed by breath. It's very attuned to rhythm, and it's meant to be a representation of impassioned speech. It's meant to be like a dramatic utterance. And as I'm sure you can tell from reading the odes, a lot of poets who came after Clodell in French were able to work from what he did around the turn of the 20th century with that style. Poets like St. John Perse, or later on Patrice de la Tour du Pin. Those are sort of his most direct inheritors, but everybody really was able to learn something from how Clodell developed the style of French prosody.
So he has an important place in French literature outside of the Catholic world.
Yes, very much so. I mean, France is, of course, a laicized, a secularized country, increasingly so since Clodell's day. But he is still admired and read in French, in France, or in the Francophone world. And I think a lot of his merit rests on what he was able to do with the language. Yeah, I mean, he's not terribly well known in English. And probably a good part of the reason for that is that we receive him in the English-speaking world through translation, and translation can only do so much to get across his stylistic brilliance and his unusual sound and feel in French. And so we first of all hit upon the ideas contained in his poetry. And if you look at Clodell that way, of course, he's this tremendously Catholic poet. And if you have any sort of issues with Catholicism, that's going to be a bit of a barrier to receiving the poetry. So he's not terribly well known outside of France, but at least not anymore. And in France, by virtue of his stylistic genius, he's been able to endure. I should say, I mean, he's always been a bit of a controversial figure. It's not as though the French, who are not Catholic and who are opposed to religion and Catholicism, they certainly have their issues with him. He was also, a rightist. He was on the political right. He served in the diplomatic corps for a government that was largely not aligned with him politically. But he was, a man of the establishment, and he was politically conservative as well as being devout religiously. So he's, of course, a controversial figure there. He's got his opponents, his foes, and he has his admirers and his friends, and those don't always line up religiously, but that certainly plays a part in it.
I found your translation very compelling and very musical. Would you be able to read us anything in the French? Is that something that you could do? Just to get a sense of what it sounds like in French?
Sure. Why don't I just read the beginning of the second ode, which I feel like is as good a place as any to get a sense for the rhythm and the sound of it.
Sure. Sure.
The second ode, deuxième ode, is called L'Esprit et l'eau in French, the spirit and the water. He begins all of them except the first with this long argument, as he calls it, an old-fashioned term in English and French for just a sort of summary of the contents. I'll skip over that. So in English, he starts the second ode. After the long smoking silence, after the great civil silence of many days, reeking with rumors and smoke, breath of plowed earth and birdsong in the large golden cities, suddenly the spirit anew, breath anew, suddenly the secret blow to the heart, the given word, sudden breath of the spirit, sharp rapture, possession. Like when in the sky full of night, before the first flash of lightning, at once the breath of Zeus descends, a whirlwind full of dust and straw and the dirty laundry of the whole town. My God, who in the beginning separated the waters above from the waters below, and who now have separated the arid zones from the earthly waters I speak of, like a child weaned from the fertile body of its mother, this hot, tenderly leafing earth, nourished only by the milk of the rain. And he goes on. That's only the beginning there of an extremely long sentence, which I won't even attempt to keep doing here. So we'll get to that aspect of the style later, maybe. But in French, he says, après le long silence fumant, après le grand silence civil de Majur, tout fumant de rumeurs et de fumée, haleine de la terre en culture et ramage des grandes villes dorées, soudain l'esprit de nouveau, soudain le souffle de nouveau, soudain le coup sourd au corps, soudain le mot donné, soudain le souffle de l'esprit, le rat sec, soudain la possession de l'esprit, comme quand dans le ciel plein de nuit avant que ne claque le premier feu de foudre, soudain le vent de Zeus dans un tourbillon plein de paille et de poussière avec la lessive de tout le village.
That French was really amazing. I mean, I could totally hear the rhythm and the music of it. Sometimes when I hear poetry in the original language, I don't always. I mean, if it's a language I'm not familiar with the contours of, I don't always immediately hear the music of it. But in that case, I could hear it very strongly. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, it's an offering. He presents the second ode there at the beginning of it to God, and so what that makes this part of the odes, and most of the odes is like this, is actually technically, I suppose, prayer. And in any case, it's address. It's the speaker of the odes is almost always addressing somebody. It's very often God, but it's also other aspects of the sacred or divine. In the first ode, it's muses. In the fourth ode, it is, as the title indicates, the muse who is grace. The entire thing is basically an act from a drama. It's a dialogue. The fourth ode, that is. Elsewhere, he will address his own soul, or himself as poet. He's always addressing someone. This is all apostrophe in a way, or address anyhow. And so it's impassioned. It like I said, it's impassioned utterance. That's the kind of classic lyric poetry that this is understood to be, the tradition in which it participates. So therefore, yeah, the rhythm is meant to capture that. It's meant to be lively. It's breathing. It's an aspiratory rhythm. It's based on how one breathes when one is speaking from the heart. And you might understand it by way of contrast with a very great poem of equal, if not greater, ambition and accomplishment from a generation later, T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, also, as the title indicates, very musically rooted. And T.S. Eliot was, at that point in his life, in his later life, also a devout man of religion. But, the Four Quartets, as astonishing as they are not prayer. They're not Orphic in that way. They're rather erudite, speculative. They employ various different strophic forms, different styles of stanzas and lineation and stuff. They're divided, very evenly in these movements. So it has a more detached feeling. T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets do. Whereas the odes by Clodell are meant to be you could almost say devotional, I suppose. I don't always like to talk about them in that way because I don't think one needs to share Clodell's faith and religious practice in order to benefit and appreciate the poetry. But nonetheless, they exhibit a certain passionate nature, which it is possible for a reader to appropriate for themselves in a way, something in the way that you might be able to glean a certain feeling or disposition from prayers, rote prayers that you already know the words to, not your own, that you make up spontaneously, even though that's what the odes are. But Clodell has made them up for us, so we can appropriate them.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Yeah, it is very personal, but also highly philosophical, it seems to me. It's like this constant turning back and forth. One interesting feature of the drama of these odes, is how he's constantly turning back and forth from one thing to another, from one approach to another, from one orientation to another. He's always, it's, am I to focus on what's outside me or what's inside me? Am I supposed to focus on sort of like the spiritual cosmos, or this rooted earthly realm as a way into that? What are my responsibilities? What's my way? And it's always this dual thing as well, both of him trying to find out what he's supposed to be as a poet and as a man. So there's this, he keeps, there are a lot of unexpected kind of spiritual turns in the poetry, which kind of keep it unpredictable in a number of ways.
Yeah, I think it's realistic in that regard. It's not as much of a persona as the speaker of a poem often can be. He's not trying to pretend to be more content and satisfied than he is, or clear-headed about any of this. His like I say, it's address. He's bearing his soul to himself, but often to God, or certain other images or persona of the divine, and so he doesn't hold anything back, and he's not afraid to be contradictory or ambiguous.
Yes.
To go back to Whitman, his famous line, do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself, for I contain multitudes. Well, Clodell certainly contained multitudes. He was a man of many contradictions. He was a man of action, a man of the world. He was a man of deep commitment to the Catholic Church and religion, but also, a great sinner in his way. He could be profoundly selfish, very bourgeois, in the sense of being sort of socially status conscious, and he carried on the love of his life was not the woman to whom he was married. It was a woman who had several marriages. His first child was an illegitimate daughter born to her. So he was a man of contradictions, and that comes through in the poetry. And his even his vocation or avocation as a poet was something he had to wrestle with. I've read, so supposedly he worked for like 1 hour a day. He permitted himself 1 hour a day to write, as much as he would permit himself amidst all of his other duties and obligations as a diplomat and as a family man, as a lover, when he was that. And that's astonishing, because he wrote an enormous amount. And but I think probably he wasn't completely at ease with writing. There's always been a bit of a tension there between the creative vocation and righteousness. I don't know, like being a good person. It takes you away from other duties, other obligations, commandments to fulfill and whatnot. And so that wears at him too. And he can sound like a diplomat. He can sound like a bourgeois man of the world, certainly in this poetry. He intends to, I assume. And part of what he argues with the Muse, in the fourth ode, is just how earthly and practical he ought to be.
Yeah, I actually thought of that Walt Whitman line, not having read Walt Whitman at all, really, but just having heard that line, "I contain multitudes," as I was reading last night, because there's another sense in which Clodell contains multitudes in this poem, which is not in the sense of self-contradiction, but one of the kind of metaphysical themes that comes up again and again in the poem is this idea of the vocation of the poet as kind of uniting all of the universe in himself, of naming and uniting things and making them eternal and kind of offering them back to God, everything reconciled with itself, with other things, and with God, and with the soul of the poet. This was also very interesting to me, and I really picked up on it because I was like, this idea was very familiar with me from another book that I read about a year ago, by one of the poets who recommended this book, James Matthew Wilson. His book Vision of the Soul is very much about this same idea, this kind of cosmic vision of everything linked together. If I can just read a passage, a couple of the passages where Clodell references this.
Yeah, please.
I know each thing, and each thing knows itself in me. I carry to each thing its deliverance. By my work, nothing remains alone, but is linked with another in my heart. And then again, it is Peter's vision when the angel showed him all the fruits of creation, every kind of animal, lowered in a sheet to earth, with God's blessing upon his free use of all. To me also every figure and form, every image of nature has been given, not as beasts for hunting and devouring, but so that I may gather them and make them present again in my spirit, each serving me to understand the others, a task better done with a living being than in metal or stone. And then one more passage on this. Let's see. This is a different. This is where he's talking about the kind of making things eternal, or recovering the seed of the eternal that is in them from God. I salute you, world liberal to my eyes. I grasp by what you are made present. The eternal is with you, and where there is the creature, the Creator has not departed. I am in you, and you are mine. Your possession is mine. And now in us the beginning resounds to the final end. The new day bursts. I do not know what angelic youth erupts from the source of day. My heart no longer beats in time. It is the instrument of endurance, while the imperishable spirit envisions passing things. But do I say passing? Here is where they begin again. Immortal? There is no more death with me. Each being, as it is eternity's work, so is it eternity's expression. Eternity is present always, and all present things pass only into eternity. So that theme kind of the poet's function, and I hope, of the function of man in general, but as especially exemplified by the poet, is present throughout these five odes.
Yeah, absolutely it is. I would call it the architectonic of the whole poem. It's the driving idea, the spiritualization of matter being the destiny, the appointed task of the human being. To use maybe a more Eastern Christian way of putting it, at least that's where I've got it from. Yeah, just what is the spirit, though? It's the breath, it's speech. Because one of the curious things is what does that mean? How do you eternalize something? Where's the user's or the owner's manual, the operating instructions for that? It's it's through language, essentially. You can't, obviously I'm going to say this, I'm a writer, I teach writing, um, but it's the word. You need language. You need language for the sacraments. There's no liturgy without language, I think. um, you transform things through language. Language is the most primordial or metaphysical. There's this. It's we live and move and have our being in it. Now, I suppose one might get a little latitude in there and thinking about what language, what actually constitutes language.
Right.
I certainly think music without words, absolute music, jazz, is a form of it. But and that pictures speak, that visual art and architecture.
Well, intelligibility is like the key aspect of what we're talking about.
A word
right?
he uses frequently in the odes, yeah. But the interesting,
so that's why music, even though it doesn't convey concepts exactly, it is intelligible. There is like a logos to it.
Yeah, exactly. Logos would be a great word to use. Yeah, it. He would know the Latin. He would see verbum in the Vulgate. He would have read the Bible in the Vulgate as well as French. But yeah, logos is, I like it. I like the Greek a little better. Yeah, but the curious thing to me is just, well, it's not curious. It's amazing that should be necessary. That it should be necessary to transfigure creation into language, into logos. I don't think there's a way of figuring out why that is, but it is what we've figured out is the case. And so for Clodell, he's sort of in awe of that and trying to state that necessity, that urge to recapitulate everything within himself, but then to articulate it. The recapitulation itself, the anakephalaiosis in Greek, is part of what happens, part of that transfiguration. But then it has to be articulated. He has to get it down in words. For him, it's words. He's a writer, he's a poet. For others, it's music, it's painting, it's architecture, it's dance. But it has to somehow be got into artistic form. And that's just, that's the amazing thing, that he's trying to not only do that, but also express his wonder at the fact that that is his task. And it's quite intimidating. In the fourth ode, I keep going back to apparently, there's this dialogue between him and the Muse. It starts with the Muse. The whole thing starts with muses in the first ode. It moves through a kind of progression. And by the fourth ode, he's talking to a muse again, but she becomes a personification of grace, as per the title of the ode, and she announces herself as such in the fourth ode eventually. And he argues with her, and it ends on a rather bleak note, and he doesn't feel up to his vocation as a poet, because it isn't just a joyful, wonderful thing that the human being has this task of transfiguring reality, spiritualizing matter, through our unique way of embodying or incarnating logos, but it's also awesome in the traditional, in the old sense of that word. It's both wonderful and joyous and terrifying. And there's a bit of that intimidation in the odes. Not a lot, because Clodell was a swaggering Gallic kind of man, which is charming to some people, off-putting to others, but I tend to like it more than I don't. And he's got a lot of spirit, a lot of vim and vigor, as they say. And so he's not going to get too intimidated, but he does have moments where that awesome task is disturbing to him.
Yes, there's a lot of boasting in the poem, and I take it as he somewhat gets a pass because because ultimately he is talking about things that are coming to him from without. He is kind of reveling in his vocation and his vision, but ultimately it is something that's coming from without. So I do give him a little bit of a pass there. Um, but he's always saying things like, uh, now the world opens itself to me again, and no matter how vast its span, my gaze sweeps it from one end to another. I have weighed the sun like a fat sheep that two strong men hang from a pole between their shoulders. I have counted and mustered the armies of heaven, surveyed from the looming figures of Easter Island to the rarest fires of the bottommost ocean, and the dark blue Pacific, where the whaler spies the whale's spume like white down. So he's always just kind of like, it is this cosmic vision, but he's always kind of um the master of it in a certain sense. It's kind of I don't see him as necessarily saying that he's achieved all of these things fully as a poet, but that this is kind of like the essence of what it is to be a poet, and that, like, insofar as one even enters into this at all, in a sense, one has entered into the whole of it, because of the unity of all things. That's my read on it anyway.
Yeah, I think his sense of himself as a Catholic man gives him enormous confidence and strength.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's one of the reasons I translated La Force as strength, not fortitude, which sounds mealy mouth to me in English. The the virtue, the cardinal virtue.
Right.
It's quite a lot about strength, and it's good to be able to talk about strength as being something that Christian faith gives one. To take that term, that good old Germanic English term, back away from maybe being associated exclusively with more toxic uses, fascist type notions. So
yeah,
I appreciate that aspect about it. But another thing that is sort of feeding into this here, excuse me, is his classicism. I mean, the nature of his education at the time would have filled him up with the Greek and Latin classics, and so he has a sense of what the more epic and ambitious poets in antiquity would have regarded as being within their purview, and consequently he feels able to take on something similar, or even to go beyond them a step. He's a sort of Lucretius, a Catholic later Lucretius. He can take on the nature of all things, and that's rewarding to encounter that valence to this. I mean, there's a part where he acknowledges and admires, but then sort of takes a step beyond Homer, Virgil, Dante, and Lucretius. He says, I see what you did, and that was good, but I have to do something else. I have to do something even better than that. And it's a great, I don't know. I like it when poets make a move like that. Milton does this famously in English a lot. It's showing your strength. It's showing, well, this is the tradition I'm in. I can do this. I can work in this tradition. It's part of how a poet establishes authority. Auctoritas, that great medieval Latin concept. That's part of how he does that. He plants himself in that Greco-Latin tradition, as well as draws on the strength and ambition that his Catholic religion is able to give him. So, like I say, that I like that. Obviously, many people do. It is something which increasingly perhaps is alienating to certain readers in the Anglophone world. It can smack of sort of imperialistic, chauvinistic it's a kind of attitude to life, which in Clodell's case, I mean, okay, so he was a servant of the French Empire. I mean, he worked in the diplomatic corps. He spent his life in places where the French imperial interest was, important. But I wouldn't worry about that with Clodell. I mean, he's really more amazed at the world, and that shows up in everything he writes. It's not even just the odes. Like his letters to his lover, his mistress Rosalie, over many years. His letters to everyone, really. He was posted to all these different places, these far-flung places that were very different from France, and he mostly was just filled with wonder and amazement at the world that he was able to see, and he would write sort of rapturously, descriptively about that, and the same way in which he was able to enter very with rich detail and sensitivity of feeling into the world of the Bible when he would write about the Bible, and sort of it's almost like reading a novel sometimes when you read his biblical commentaries. The way he's able to enter into that world, he gets into the world. He's into this life, and that's because he has this sense of his ultimate role being to take it all in, as much of it as he can, and in his consciousness transfigure it.
At the beginning of every episode, I always say that this podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org, and that's because Catholic Culture is a much bigger apostolate than just our podcasts. We offer so many resources: Catholic news and commentary, resources for living the liturgical year, a massive and ever-growing library of Catholic reference material, free of charge. Astonishingly, we end up reaching tens of millions of Catholics and potential converts every year, and part of that is because we allow others to reuse our material free of charge. It's widely used in social media, reprinted on other websites, used in television and radio programs. My own podcast is rebroadcast by a Catholic radio station in Texas, and we don't charge them anything to do that. Our articles reappear in print media, magazines, newspapers, parish bulletins. I've personally met priests who say that they use our material for catechesis and for inspiration, for homilies. And this is really an international thing because we get plenty of emails from priests in places like India and Africa who use our material for catechesis. Now, Catholic Culture is a nonprofit, and we run almost entirely on donations. As you can imagine, every year there's sort of a question, okay, are we going to be able to keep going next year? Especially right now, we are struggling financially because our income was down about 25% during the summer of the pandemic, and we lost quite a lot of monthly pledges from people who had been hurt economically. And so it is time for our 2020 Fall Challenge campaign. Thankfully, a generous donor has offered a matching grant of $100,000, which means, well, it's self-explanatory, all of your gifts between now and December 8th, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, will be matched. If you'd like to help keep this and our other 3 podcasts going, please go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio. And if you can't donate, or even if you can, please also keep us in your prayers. We depend on those as much as on financial support. And as I've said many times, we pray for all of our listeners, donors, all of our users every day. Thank you, and God bless you. There's another recurring theme here related to this kind of role of uniting things, which is the mutual necessity of everything that exists. He kind of this idea, and I see it as very not classical, but kind of medieval, or kind of like as part of the grand Christian tradition of like a cosmic vision, but especially of like the chain of being and the responsibility that man has to, anybody who's the head of something is not just the lord over it, but it's representative. So if man is the head over the rest of the material world, then he's not only its Lord, but he's its representative and its mouthpiece. And so that's what I see in this idea of everything being necessary to him and him being necessary to everything else in the poet, exemplifying this charge that man has been given. To be the eyes. Now I'm quoting a Werner Herzog documentary I watched the other day, but basically to be the eyes with which the universe sees itself, um, as well as the function already mentioned of giving everything back to God. Um, that is, of course, that's something that is fulfilled first and foremost by Christ. But this kind of role as man being the consciousness of, the universe doesn't actually have its own consciousness. It's man who is the consciousness of the universe.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much spot on for him. I would say that I think he has, well, it's a very interesting thing, isn't it? Especially in the Catholic tradition. The number of potential targets of address. They're not. So he does talk to God a lot. As far as being the head of something and transfiguring and rendering back, yeah, indeed, through Christ. Though, I mean, he's a Catholic. He thinks of himself as part of the body of Christ, and so what Christ recapitulates, Clodell does too, in his own infinitely lesser way, but it's analogically the same recapitulation. But to get back to the thing about man being the consciousness, yeah, that comes across for sure in the odes. It's part of, it's sort of implied as part of the poet's vocation. But one thing that's interesting is the address. So, well, here's a question that I often have with this kind of stuff: how seriously are we to take his interlocutors? I mean, so if we take the poetic voice seriously, there's really this authentic, genuine, personal voice speaking here in this poems, then it seems to me sort of logically necessary to take his interlocutors equally seriously. Otherwise, it's a bit of a dissembling. And he speaks to the muses, this muse who is grace. He speaks to the dead, to the communion of saints. And he, in various different ways, not always through direct address, brings Mary into the poem. I mean, the third ode is called Magnificat. It's sort of it's a Christmas setting. Clodell heard the Magnificat sung at Vespers and Christmas in 1886 when he had his own sort of conversion or reversion experience at Notre Dame of Paris. That's kind of why I wanted that church to be on the cover. That and the fact that the thing burnt down as I was translating it. But so he brings in these other less than totally absolute or transcendent aspects of divinity and the sacred into the poem. It's quite epic in scope in that sense. It's got the living and the dead. It's got these figures, mostly female. Is very important for Clodell. He was very sort of female-oriented kind of man, if that makes sense. And he talks to them as well. So it makes me wonder, well, okay, how seriously do we take them, and what is their role in this cosmic action of transfiguration through poesis? They need to be there for him to have someone to talk to much of the time. It's not all directly prayer to God. It's it's much more this thing that, for me anyway, is kind of amazing about Catholicism, and the way it has a huge, I don't want to say pantheon, that's not the right word, but it's got a panoply of figures with whom one is in communication, potentially. And I think maybe the Muse is there, and Mary, and the grace of being an inspired poet. But really, at the end of the odes, what comes in is his, and in the processional, as well as in the end of the fifth ode, what really comes in, and what I've found unusually moving, well, more moving than I had previously found it when I was trying to reread it, is the dead, the communion of saints, and also his own ancestors, the sort of anonymous ranks of the generations that have preceded him. He has a very strong sense of that. And, so this makes him, I don't know, traditionalist. He's more on the cultural right, I suppose. Like I was saying earlier, it's not appetizing to some, but it's a very strong sense with him. His sense of having inherited his faith, and being grateful for that, and his place in the world as a Frenchman, his feeling rooted in the soil, sort of autochthonic. That's a big part of his sensibility, and part of how. So I guess what I'm trying to say in response to what you were saying is that there is consciousness for him, and I suppose it is still human in a way, but or anthropomorphic, I suppose, in the form of the Muses. But there are these, as you said, the chain of being. So there are gradations between man and God for him, perhaps you could say, and the deceased are actually somewhere up in that chain too.
Yeah, that whole final section of the poem where he's addressing different beings, including the living, the saints, the souls of the dead, the poor. He even explicitly references praying for the souls in purgatory. It's just this amazing cosmic vision, which I think is a great deal of what is very appealing to me about this this poem. A lot of it functions like spiritual reading, especially on my first reading of it. When we read spiritual reading for instruction, we read it for counsel, but also we read it to keep a vision before our eyes that can easily be forgotten, or we can easily be distracted from. And it's in that sense that I say it functioned in a way at times like spiritual reading. I mean, I found in the vision that he gives, I found myself, especially as an artist, kind of looking and kind of being put to shame. Like, in particular, this one section here, he says, my freedom is bounded by my station in your captivity, and by my passionate role in this great game, so that I might not miss even one ray of your life-creating light destined to me. I extend my hands to left and to right, so that by me not one gap should exist in the perfect circle of your creations. So this gets at kind of the necessity of not wanting to miss one. Again, it focuses it functions doubly for the artist and for the Christian, not wanting to miss one bit of grace destined to you, but also this more cosmic function of like the way that grace operates in us is to it brings the whole cosmos to perfection, and not only each part in itself, but in relation to the rest, so that not one gap should exist. And so when I read that, I found myself kind of like thinking about, like, gosh, how many hours in my life have really been dedicated to making sure that not one gap should exist in the perfect circle of God's creation, or that I missed not even one ray of his life creating light. I found it kind of inspiring me and putting me to shame simultaneously in a very deep way. So that it's a beautiful poem in that respect.
Yeah, I certainly can relate to the simultaneous inspiration and you know, indirect chastisement from a man who's been dead for well over half a century. Yeah, it's so one of the some of the language in the odes that I initially, when I first read these poems in college, found most difficult is this notion of a closed world that he talks about. And he had a very strong sense of creation as well, I'll just say of creation. So, which is to say, of a perfect world, that we live in a cosmos, a world that is perfectly ordered and complete. We don't really add anything to it. And as far as I'm aware, physical science tells us that that is indeed the case. So if that's so, then what? How does one think of oneself? We tend now, I think, to be very identitarian and think of ourselves in individualistic ways, perhaps. But for him, one thinks of oneself, if one lives in a cosmos, as defined by limitation. I mean, you have this incredible capaciousness in terms of consciousness, but in terms of your life, you occupy a station. You play a role or several roles, a family of roles, you could say. And maybe the line between role and identity is not always such a clear thing, but I find the language of role and station, vocation, is helpful in understanding his sensibility, his view that seems to me necessitated by his perception of himself, all of us, as living in an actual cosmos. In the introduction to the odes, I wrote a little bit about this, how he's rather unusual in that way among artists of the last couple hundred years, at least, in having this very strong sense of dwelling in a cosmos. But there's a few others, and that combined with his great confidence that we've already spoken about, I think that makes him a bit unusual. But yeah, he has this sense of a cosmos, and if you live in a cosmos, then you have a certain role to play. You have a vocation to fulfill, and that's how he went about things. But I'm sure, I mean, as we've said, he has his moments of doubt or misgiving, or at least recognition of his own shortcomings in this poetry. In the processional there at the end, I think near where you quoted earlier, he talks about, he sort of looks back. The whole thing is set, it's a scene, it's a dramatic scene, like so much of his poetry. It's him leaving church at the Feast of the Assumption. And as he's doing that, he's sort of surveying his life, at least at one point. And he looks back over his life and he realizes his shortcomings and his sins. And when he's writing that ode in 1907, his life over the preceding 7 years has been quite dramatic. He thought he had a vocation to the contemplative life, and that vocation was refused, upon which he went to China again in 1900. And on that boat trip to China, he met Rosalie and began this passionate relationship that eventually resulted in his first natural child. And then he went back to France. They did 5-year stints, and he went back to France when he was married, and then started a family with his wife. Came back to China, and now he's back in China, and for another stint in the Far East, and it's a lot to go through in your 30s. A lot of shifts, failures, errors, sins. Yeah, I mean, and he is conscious of that. So I hear you about you hear the poet talking like, well, I don't want to miss one grace that's been granted to me, but some of his own passionate feeling about what he had missed or gotten wrong, or just didn't really know what he was doing, blundering around as we do. That feeling's in the odes too, I think, for sure. Even at the end there in the processional, which is this incredibly doxological and dogmatic and confessional kind of conclusion.
Half of it is taken from scripture in various places. I
Yeah,
noticed.
well, it's like, I mean, he's just been in mass, and so he's kind of got various things from the mass in his head. I forget what all, the Kyrie and the genealogy, and like there's all kinds of stuff in there. Yeah. And then he ends with this sort of really solid, basic creedal Christian proclamation there at the end. The Trinitarian utterance there concludes the whole thing. The whole thing ends in this very Trinitarian way, I guess. Yeah. It's but the idea is that you have a role, which is another way of saying a kind of limitation, and that is how you think of yourself best. The inward, he does balance that. So the last ode proper, the fifth ode, is called the Closed House, and he does construct this, or he sort of dwells on the notion of inwardness and being in a way, closed off from the world. Christian discourse has to walk this fine and paradoxical line between fulfilling this cosmic destiny of spiritualizing all matter, but in order to do that, weirdly, you do at least sometimes have to close yourself off from the world. And so he has this another dramatic dialogue in the fifth ode there, where he sets the poet up as being accused of being closed off, disregarding things that the mundane world wants him to pay attention to. And then his wife steps in. So now he's married. He's come back to China now. He's married. He's not just in love with the wife of another diplomat. He's got a wife of his own now. So now there's a wife in the poetry. And so his wife defends him, and then he defends himself. And then he launches into this thing about the four cardinal virtues, and then it transitions at the end into that paean to the communion of the saints and the dead and all that.
I love this section, and I was going to bring it up. This idea of being closed off. I mean, it connects to what you said about the closed universe, but also just as a practical necessity for the poet. And I loved the bit where his wife talks about how she kind of protects him in a sense from the outside world. I take it as he has his duties with his family. He doesn't have to be this ambitious single man forever kind of dealing with matters of the world and maybe promoting himself, maybe promoting his work. He's busy with his family, and that gives him a sort of freedom to ignore the outside world. And in that way, his wife protects him. But it also made me think of another French writer, the Dominican priest, Sertalange, I think that's how you pronounce his name. He wrote a great book called The Intellectual Life, and at one point he talks about how the duty of the intellectual's wife is to like curate his social circle and keep and not force him to interact with frivolous people and stuff, so that he can focus on his work and being recollected and inward and stuff, which I think is great. And this part of the poem kind of reminded me of that as well.
Yeah. I think that is kind of what he has her saying there. And I mean, and of course, I can certainly understand how people get annoyed at the male chauvinism in this aspect of it. It's sort of, it can make her out to be sort of his butler, or
right.
I don't know what, but But actually, he has a really amazing ideal of marriage, man and woman working together. And as I've already said, I haven't been able to detail it really in this discussion, but for anyone who reads the odes will realize how overwhelmingly important a female persona is to him. It's dominant in the odes, and
Right.
he very much, learns from female figures in various ways, I think. Yeah, but then when he gets actually married, and then when marriage comes into the poems, he does set that household as a kind of sanctuary.
More on the metaphysical level, this idea of closing yourself, paradoxically closing yourself off to the world, yet having it within you. We don't need to discuss this at length, but I just love this line where he compares. He says, "Make all creation come within the ark, as did Noah," which immediately I was like, "Oh, of course, that's what Noah's Ark means." I never thought of it in like contemplative terms, but of course that's what the Noah's Ark means. That's so obvious. How did I miss that? But I really loved that interpretation of the Noah's Ark there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he loved reading the Bible. He read it all the time, and eventually he started to just mainly write about that, um, which is kind of interesting in itself. The idea that his writing shifted to writing about other writing. Now, it's a special form of other writing, but and I think that in a way. Excuse me. The reason that happened was maybe because the Bible sort of was itself ark-like for Clodell. It contained everything, and he was able to return to it constantly. As I started out by talking about his prosody and the Psalms. I mean, maybe I didn't mention the Psalms. I must have. I know I do in the intro. That the Hebrew Psalms are, well, he would have read them in Latin. They're hugely important to his prosody and his style in this poetry, and also in their amplitude. They kind of contain the whole range of human, the primordial emotions from joy to despair, and he's able to learn from them in that way.
Just to touch on one more spiritual theme here, in the fourth, which you mentioned before, the fourth ode, the Muse who is grace. There's a transformation, but from the Muse to grace, but there's also an analogy between them in that both require a kind of self-abandonment. And it made me think. So he said, let me read this passage here. One of my favorite passages here. "Let me be necessary. Let me truly fill a place that is well known and approved, like the industrial magnate or the empire builder, laying tracks from shore to shore, or like the union boss, though these are good for nothing. When a youth, his chin adorned with a pale, thin, golden fleece, when he fashions verse, well, we smile. I waited for age to deliver me from that Bacchic delirium. This I refuse, to give my art to the laughter that seizes most hidden depths. I will not make the burnt offering to the god. At least let me make of this paper what I would. Let me fill it with a studied artistry, as one who has a cleared task. Like the Egyptian scribe meticulous in his inventory of tribute, the shares of plunder, captives chained 10 by 10, and measures of wheat borne to the common mill." So he wants this. He wants to be in control, basically. He wants to be a craftsman. Uh, he wants everything to be measured and weighed, and he doesn't want the Bacchic delirium. And it reminded me of this line from Plato's Phaedrus. Socrates says this: "If anyone comes to the gates of poetry and expects to become an adequate poet by acquiring expert knowledge of the subject without the muse's madness, he will fail, and his self-controlled verses will be eclipsed by the poetry of men who have been driven out of their minds." So it's a great, and of course it works with grace too. Grace is more than just the acquisition of virtue. Grace is ultimately a super rational uh, union. It is more than just self-control. Ultimately, the purpose of self-control in the sense of gaining virtue is to allow ourselves to give up control.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, if you're a musician, you have to practice. You're not going to you're not going to make it without an incredible amount of practice and determination. But the end result of that is mastery, and when you attain that, you can let yourself go, and you will do what you intend to do, or you will do as you're moved to do, without second thought. This sort of damning self-awareness, irony. Yeah, it's one must study to be unself-conscious. It's a bit of a paradox, but he wants mastery. I mean, we know what Plato thought about what poets know, which is to say nothing, nothing much. Yeah, and so it's not really knowledge that he's after or that he needs to have. So the muse will come along and say, "No, you need to get drunk. I want to hear you laugh drunk." in that ode, the muse definitely takes the Platonic position there, but it's not an undisciplined revelry.
Right.
That craftsmanship is not. I guess the reason is that craftsmanship is not about uh, the self. It's about the material that you're working on. It's about what you can do to the stuff, whatever that may be. And so whatever you have to do with the self to do that is what you have to do. And what you have to do with the self is get over it, discipline it, so that it uses its faculties to work on the material in the desired way, and doesn't let those faculties distract it. And it's it's incredibly difficult. Of course, it takes a long time to become an artist, a craftsman of any sort.
I did a whole episode on this with a great jazz pianist, improviser, composer, Mark Christopher Brandt, who was my teacher, and a whole he did a whole has done a series of albums and DVDs where he just improvises like a whole album solo piano from scratch. But the title of the third one is Structure and Freedom. So this idea of freedom within structure is something that I have been hearing from him since I was a teenager, and something that is a kind of a necessary bit of practical wisdom for the jazz musician. And so it's something that makes a lot of sense to me when I hear you talk about it or when I hear it in Claudel. But yeah, I think that the people, the artists who think that they can just be in complete self control and have everything be a result of craft, I don't think we can just go back to a kind of like unconscious uh, craftsman artist ideal. I think it would be false to try to turn back time and make the romantic era never happen. I think everything needs to be synthesized and integrated properly. But I don't think that our greater awareness, but an awareness which clearly the ancients had of kind of the more inspired or ecstatic aspects of being an artist, I don't think that we can just put that back in the box, as irritating as kind of some of the high flown language might be to people at times.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the one hand, the artist is confronted with the fact that art is about truth, and truth is outside of the self.
Mm-hmm.
That's inspiration. That's where you get inspiration. The idea of art, you you're transcribing something else when you do art right. And on the other hand, the artist is confronted with the, I would say, manifest, self-evident truth that constraint is productive. In the structure is where you find the freedom, and that's where Clodell's talking about the role that he has to play, the limitations that allow him to fulfill his vocation, to not miss any of that grace, the inspiration. So yeah, you're on the one hand, at one level, you're working in a world that is fruitful because of its constraint. There's a notion that's proximate to an idea of chastity too, maybe you could say, or a Catholic idea of marriage. But another at another level, the artist is confronted with a thing that's completely boundless and unpredictable, and the irony or the paradox, the wonder of it is that sort of boundless, indefinite inspiration, this flowing light that is the truth, is only expressible in our world through being in a form. It has to have a form of some kind, and it has to have a constraint. It has to occupy a particular place. It has to be limited, and it takes a lot of learning and skill to develop the craft of figuring out how to do that, how to channel the indefinite, the infinite thing that you're given just this tiny access to into a bit of form, into a constrained, limited thing, so that someone else might be able to share in it too. And so Clodell hits on that in a lot of ways. And maybe to tie this back into the poetics, because this paradoxical notion about the fruitfulness of constraint and how the inspiration, the infinite inspiration, is expressed through finite form. So this is free verse. This is vers.
I was about to ask about this. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's a lot of different ways of thinking about form and poetry, and the idea that metrical, that meter and rhyme are what constitute poetic form is pretty limiting. I have nothing against so-called formal poetry in English. In fact, it's mainly what I read, I guess, for pleasure. But that's just looking at like the superficies of language. There is a music of image, and there is like I started out by saying, the rhythmical aspect of it, that's associated with the breath. That's how these versets are composed, according to breath, and the breath is, we are spirit and body. Well, the breath is the spirit. We are soul and body, and then the spirit is linking the two. And so the breath has something to do with what is being said. It's not just pure rhythm on its own. And so yeah, there's this music of image and idea. There's what you could call the noetic rhythm of the poem, and in that way, there's quite a bit of structure and form to these things, whether you're looking at the scale of the whole odes together, all 5 of them, and the processional, or whether you're looking at a given ode, or sometimes even just a verse paragraph within the ode. There's quite a lot of structure, a lot of construction, a lot of form.
The reason I got this book, as I mentioned before, was the blurb from James Matthew Wilson, specifically his comparison of Clodell to Tolkien. I'm a huge Tolkien fan. He compares him in I think in his cosmic vision, especially to Tolkien. Also compares him, says he is a new Tom Bombadil, who moves through the world without irony, because he has already transcended the jaded and impoverished vision typical of the modern age, and entered with joy into an experience of the universal and the eternal. You also compare Clodell to Tolkien in your introduction. Why is that?
Yeah, so it's a strange comparison to make.
Mhm.
one of them is really, well, they're just such utterly different genres of writing, but because they both beheld uh, the world as perfected. For Tolkien, this is maybe just going to sound totally weird or mystical. I don't know, but for Tolkien, that's Faerie. That's Middle Earth. It's the world of fantasy, as we now call it. Um, and I always like when I bring up fantasy to mention that the root of that word means basically vision, something you behold. Um, and for Clodell, it's not that. It's really just this world. We've talked in various ways about how much he's like a earthy kind of guy, a man of this world, successful bourgeois man, albeit of rather peasant roots. But he sees it transfigured. He sees it under its, what you could call its Sophianic aspect, Sophia, the wisdom of God, the way God intends, the way God beholds creation, you could almost say. It's he beholds it as the kingdom. Maybe you could also say he beholds it as a child. We often associate fantasy with childhood, and that's because in childhood one is more able to see the world in this way. And so, in a way, yeah, there's this Tom Bombadil, there's this childlike aspect to Tolkien and to Clodell. They are in the world and they're just thrilled by it. That word gets used so lightly, but I mean, how often are we really thrilled by the world, especially maybe in this year? But no, really, in adult life, I mean, we are not enamored of existence most of the time, but at least in the writing, it's something like the Odes of Clodell, or in a lot of the tale telling of Tolkien, it's just this glorious vision of what the world is. Tolkien could only get that across by reimagining the Earth as Middle Earth. But really, what it is, it's this paradoxical utterance. There's like a million ways to say it, and yet none of them are quite adequate. For the fantasist sees fairyland or believes in fairyland. Fairyland, faerie, is it's a good French word, really. So it's nice to end on that. It is this world, but it is also not this world, because it's this world under its Sophianic aspect. This world as the kingdom of God, rather than a broken human social world, a polluted, nasty world that we made a mess of. But it is also that world. So that it's two worlds and it's one. And Clodell somehow manages to do the same thing. He sees this world both as it is truly and as it appears, and he can revel in the appearance as well as in the truth of it, and that makes him basically a joyful, doxological poet, a poet of praise. One of the distinctive functions of the lyric poet in this ancient tradition, going back to before the time of Christ, is to be doxological. It's sort of where the poet, it's another way he gains his authority, is to say, I am the one who can sing the praises of existence. I can sing praises of the creator on behalf of the creation. That's actually a big part of what this whole spiritualization of matter, this transfiguration of reality actually is to praise, to give a voice of praise to those things which appear to not have that to us.
Right.
Including elves and such, whatever, and to the extent that I think you can think of such creatures as sort of personifications of the beauty and sort of blessedness of the natural world, the non-human world. which Tolkien sort of thought of them as. I mean, he was a very earthy guy too. The idea of fantasy as like escape from the earth is profoundly alien to the classic tradition of fantasy, and Tolkien especially. He was a very earthy guy.
Not supernatural creatures. They're like they're like hypernatural creatures.
Yeah. So sophianic nature, I guess. I like that word, that idea. Nature, or unfallen nature, which is this nature, but we just have such an incredibly difficult time perceiving it as that. The liturgy is meant to reveal it, all of it. That's why it uses these elements of it, but mixed with craft. I mean, it's wine. It's not grapes you pluck off the bough. It's bread. It's not just sheaves of grass that you've torn from the earth before you go into the church. So yeah, that human artistry enters into it there too. It takes artistry to reveal fairy land or Middle Earth, and it takes artistry to perform this function that Clodell is doing as a poet in the odes, to recapitulate everything, transfigure it, turn it all into praise.
Jonathan, this has been a pleasure. Thank you for writing this translation. I think I'll have to get a copy of it for some people for Christmas. So again, for people, the book is Five Great Odes by Paul Claudel. Let me hold it up here. I don't think I did that before. From Angelico Press. And thank you so much for generous with your time and coming on the show, Jonathan.
Thank you for having me, Thomas.